William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, Inferno of Atlanta, Georgia. Howl. Why Sherman burned the Confederacy's heart. In November 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman, with his fiery red hair, piercing blue eyes, and beard flecked with gray, emerged from the charred ruins of Atlanta. Sherman wasn't here to sip sweet tea or marvel at the moss-draped oaks of Georgia. His purpose? To make Georgia howl. With 62,000 battle-hardened soldiers, Sherman aimed to reach Savannah, carving a 285-mile path of destruction through the heart of the Confederacy. But Savannah wasn't his only goal. It was merely the finale to a campaign designed to break the South's will to fight. Sherman's plan wasn't born out of a moment of fury, but was the calculated brainchild of total war. A concept to cripple not just armies, but the very infrastructure and morale that sustained them. The march was his way of bringing the war to every Georgian doorstep. The general himself, dressed in his simple blue uniform, led from the front, his cold eyes set on the horizon. His men weren't merely an army. They were harbingers of destruction. They tore up railroads, twisted the rails into Sherman's neckties, looted farms, burned cotton, and laid waste to plantations. By the end of the campaign, Sherman's name would be cursed across the South. Sherman's destructive genius was no accident. The seeds of his strategy had been planted by his close friend, Ulysses S. Grant, a whiskey-loving but brilliant tactician elevated to supreme command in 1864. Grant's vision for victory was simple, yet ruthless: exhaust the Confederacy. He understood that merely defeating Confederate armies wasn't enough. To win, the Union needed to destroy the South's ability and will to wage war. This wasn't just about battles. It was about breaking the South's economy and morale. Sherman was the man to execute this vision. Born in Ohio in 1820, Sherman was a graduate of West Point and a loyal friend to Grant, even when the latter was drowning his failures in whiskey. Sherman himself had faced his demons, including a mental breakdown early in the war. But by 1864, he was Grant's most trusted lieutenant, a general who could turn chaos into strategy. Grant's strategy of exhaustion wasn't limited to Sherman. It was a coordinated assault on the Confederacy from 5 directions. General Nathaniel Banks, tasked with capturing Mobile, Alabama, though this plan shifted to an invasion of Texas. Banks, a former politician, struggled with military actions but was determined to prove his worth. Army of the Potomac engaged Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a brutal war of attrition near Richmond, the Confederate capital. General Benjamin Butler, a controversial and often criticized commander, Butler led a campaign against Richmond from the southeast. Franz Sigel disrupted Confederate supply lines in the Shenandoah Valley, though his efforts were met with mixed success. Sherman's campaign against Atlanta, the crown jewel of the strategy, targeting the South's most critical railroad hub. Atlanta was no ordinary city. As Dr. Gordon Jones aptly put it, Atlanta is the hinge point of the Confederacy. Second only to Richmond in strategic importance, Atlanta was a manufacturing hub and the crossroads for supplies and troops moving through the South. Capturing Atlanta meant severing the Confederacy's lifeline. But Atlanta's significance wasn't born of secessionist fervor. In 1860, many Atlantans had voted for pro-Union candidates, driven by the city's railroad and commercial interests. As Dr. Wendy Vanette noted, Atlanta's success stemmed from the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which linked it to Chattanooga. Businessmen had thrived in the Union and were initially reluctant to embrace secession. Atlanta's transformation into a fortress began long before Sherman arrived. A year earlier, Confederate forces dismantled homes and farms to construct 12 miles of fortifications around the city, built largely with slave labor. By 1864, Atlanta was the 3rd most fortified city in the Confederacy, trailing only Richmond and Washington, D.C. Despite these defenses, Sherman's combined forces, Army of the Cumberland, Army of the Tennessee, and Army of the Ohio, marched southward from Chattanooga in spring 1864. In the grim and foreboding year of 1864, the fate of Georgia rested on the shoulders of a 57-year-old Virginian blue blood named Joseph Eggleston Johnston. A West Point graduate and veteran of the Mexican War, Johnston had earned his stripes and scars in battle. Twice wounded and promoted for gallantry during the Mexican War, Johnston had over 30 years of service in the U.S. Army when the Civil War began. But his extensive military resume came with a streak of pride and a knack for ruffling feathers, particularly those of his Confederate boss, Jefferson Davis. Johnston's feud with Jefferson Davis began over something most soldiers wouldn't dare challenge: rank and seniority. When the Confederacy was organizing its top military brass, Johnston believed his years of experience entitled him to the highest rank. Davis disagreed. The perceived snub sparked a rivalry that simmered for years, fueling distrust and animosity that would affect Confederate strategy at critical moments. While Davis saw Johnston as obstinate and self-serving, Johnston viewed Davis as micromanaging and petty. They couldn't agree on much, but their mutual disdain was as constant as the war itself. Despite his issues with Davis, Johnston had a way of inspiring his men. When he took over the battered Confederate Army of Tennessee after their crushing defeat at Missionary Ridge, his troops were demoralized and in tatters. Johnston, with a touch of aristocratic flair, worked to restore their morale. He ensured they were resupplied, dressed in crisp new uniforms, and even carried freshly minted flags into battle. These acts of care won him the admiration of his soldiers, who saw him as a leader committed to their survival and dignity. Meanwhile, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, Johnston's nemesis, was plotting his way into Georgia. Unlike Johnston, Sherman wasn't a decorated war hero from Mexico, but he was cunning, relentless, and determined to break the Confederacy's backbone. On May 7, 1864, the Atlanta campaign officially began with the first shots fired at Tunnel Hill, just northwest of Dalton. Johnston's forces held the high ground along Rocky Face Ridge, daring Sherman to attack head-on. Sherman, far from foolish, had no intention of launching a suicidal assault on Johnston's rocky defenses. Instead, he devised a plan to trap Johnston's army. He sent General James McPherson and 24,000 men through Snake Creek Gap to encircle the Confederates. The move could have ended the campaign before it truly began, but McPherson hesitated. It was his first time in Army command, and his cautious approach allowed Johnston to slip away. Sherman, frustrated, later scolded McPherson. "Mac, you missed the opportunity of a lifetime." Over the next 2 weeks, Johnston masterfully conducted a series of strategic retreats, avoiding direct confrontation with Sherman's superior forces. At Cassville, Johnston saw a rare chance to destroy an isolated column of Sherman's army, a move that could have altered the course of the war. But reports of Union troops on his flank spooked him into canceling the attack. Sherman, ever the opportunist, pressed forward, outflanking Johnston repeatedly and forcing the Confederates to retreat 50 miles across 2 major rivers, the Etowah and the Chattahoochee, by the end of May. Back in Atlanta, the grim reality of war was becoming impossible to ignore. On May 15th, Sam Richards, a bookseller, took a walk through the city cemetery, now Oakland Cemetery. His diary entry reflected the despair of the time. "The saddest sight that I have ever seen is the acre of fresh-dug graves, a symbol of this terrible war." Richards, an English-born Unionist turned reluctant Confederate, joined the city's militia in defense of Atlanta, but made no secret of his distaste for combat. "I hate the sight of a musket." To Sherman, the turning point came when his army crossed the Etowah River. He called it Georgia's Rubicon, a point of no return. Sherman believed that if he could cross the Etowah, nothing could stop him from reaching Atlanta. His confidence was well-founded. By now, Johnston's army was demoralized, constantly retreating, and yearning for their leader to make a stand. Historian Mary Boykin Chesnut immortalized Johnston's hesitance with a scathing analogy. Johnston was like a marksman at a bird shoot who refused to take a shot for fear of ruining his perfect record. The Confederate general's reputation for caution frustrated his troops, who were desperate for a decisive victory. Finally, in late May, Johnston dug in along a 10-mile defensive line stretching from Pickett's Mill to New Hope Church. The terrain was brutal. Deep ravines, dense undergrowth, and poor roads turned the area into a nightmarish battleground. Soldiers on both sides called it the hellhole for good reason. General William T. Sherman's march to Atlanta had hit a snag, a rocky, heavily fortified snag named Kennesaw Mountain. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, cautious and calculating, had drawn his defensive lines in a crescent shape, stretching from Marietta to Kennesaw Mountain. Stationed to the south, fiery General John Bell Hood held the thinnest section, while the ever-reliable General William Hardee guarded the northernmost flank. Johnston himself kept his command post further east in Marietta, overseeing operations with the air of a chessmaster surveying his board. Sherman, the Union's fiery-headed conductor, decided on June 24th that brute force was his baton of choice. His plan was audacious. Schofield's Army of the Ohio would nudge south, McPherson's Army of the Tennessee would feint north, and George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland would strike straight through Hood's vulnerable line. Victory meant prying open the Confederate defenses and barreling toward Atlanta. But war, as Sherman was about to find out, rarely dances to one's tune. By June 27th, the stage was set. The Confederates, entrenched and alert, stared down an unforgiving landscape of tangled thickets, steep inclines, and sweltering heat. Hood's men, hardened veterans led by the likes of Major General Benjamin Cheatham and the indomitable Patrick Cleburne, awaited from their strongholds. To the north, Hardee's men fortified their positions, while Johnston nervously monitored from Marietta, fully aware of the stakes. At 8 a.m., Union cannons roared to life, shaking the mountain and sending Confederate soldiers scrambling into their trenches. Thick smoke and deafening blasts transformed the battlefield into a living nightmare. Behind the cannons, the Union soldiers prepared to charge. Among them were Brigadier General John Newton and Jefferson C. Davis, no relation to the Confederate president, each leading their divisions into what many would call a slaughter. Newton's brigades, led by Generals Wagner and Harker, advanced in column formation, a decision as bold as it was disastrous. Rather than spreading out, they created a singular, tempting target for Confederate sharpshooters. Hood's men poured fire into the advancing ranks, the sound of rifles blending into an unending roar. Newton's men never reached their objective. Meanwhile, Davis's brigade, under Colonel Daniel McCook, pushed toward Cheatham's Hill. Crossing a creek and climbing steep, uneven terrain, they met fierce resistance. As McCook led the charge, he fell, mortally wounded. Captain Fellows, rallying his men with a cry of "Come on, boys, we'll take it," was shot dead mere feet from Confederate trenches. Colonel Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee Regiment later recalled the chaos. "The sun beamed down on our uncovered heads, the thermometer at 110 degrees in the shade. A solid line of blazing fire poured from Yankee guns into our faces, singeing hair and clothes. The blood of our dead and wounded spurted onto us. The air filled with blinding smoke, and the roar of battle deafened us. It was as if hell had broken loose in Georgia." In the midst of the carnage, a forest fire broke out, engulfing wounded Union soldiers. Their agonized screams echoed across the battlefield. Then a Confederate officer emerged, waving a white flag. "Come and get your men, for they are burning to death," he shouted. Fighting ceased as soldiers from both sides, unarmed, rushed to rescue the injured and extinguish the flames. In a moment of humanity, enemies became allies. By 11:30 a.m., the assault had ended. Sherman had failed to break the Confederate line, losing nearly 3,000 men, including valuable officers. The Confederates lost approximately 1,000. Union forces held their ground within yards of Confederate trenches, hastily constructing parapets. Meanwhile, the battlefield's dead and dying filled the air with an unbearable stench. Colonel Watkins later reflected, "The screams of the wounded echoed day and night. The stench of decaying bodies nauseated even the strongest among us." Despite their tactical victory, Johnston's forces could not hold forever. Sherman, undeterred, bypassed the Confederate line, aiming to cut them off from Atlanta. Under the cover of darkness on July 2nd, Johnston ordered a retreat to the Chattahoochee River, systematically burning bridges behind him. By mid-July, the Confederate Army was forced to abandon the river, retreating further into Atlanta. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain marked the bloodiest day of Sherman's Atlanta campaign. The sounds of the battle reverberated as far as Atlanta, prompting many civilians to flee in fear of the coming storm. While Sherman reeled from his losses, his resolve to capture Atlanta only grew. The war's tide would soon turn, but not without exacting a heavy toll on both sides. Amid the chaos, the personal tragedies of war continued to unfold. In Georgia, Rhoda Mobley received a letter informing her of her husband Francis's death in far-off Virginia. Enclosed was a grim memento, the ball that killed him. Such tokens were cold comfort to grieving families who could only imagine the distant graves of their loved ones. The summer of 1864 saw the city of Atlanta perched on the edge of ruin. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston had drawn his defensive lines just north of the city, retreating yet again before the relentless advance of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. For the citizens of Atlanta, Johnston's cautious strategy felt like a slow death. The city's streets buzzed with fear, speculation, and growing frustration. It was Dr. Wendy Vennett who later observed, "It was at this point that Atlanta truly began to become unglued." As Sherman's forces edged closer, a wave of panic swept through Atlanta like wildfire. The passenger depot became the epicenter of chaos as families, sensing the inevitable, scrambled to escape. Trains were packed to bursting, with people jostling, crying, and shouting as they clutched their most precious belongings. The first batch to flee included wealthy merchants and government officials, leaving the working-class residents to fend for themselves. The scene was pure pandemonium, a desperate exodus, with the city's population rapidly dwindling from 20,000 to a mere 4,000 within weeks. Who stayed behind? Mostly white women, children, and enslaved individuals. Most of Atlanta's men had joined the Confederate Army, been conscripted, or fled to avoid conscription. For many women, the reality of war had become heartbreakingly personal. North of Atlanta, Nellie Jett's life was unraveling. With a farm to tend, 4 children, and 2 elderly in-laws to care for, she was caught in the crosshairs of war. She wrote to her husband, serving in Virginia with the Confederate Army, "I wish you was at home. I know if the main army falls back here, we will perish. I don't know what to do. I ain't got the money to take us off, so we will have to stand the test. I ain't going to run." Her words were a raw declaration of resolve and despair, a testament to the courage of women left to face the war's brutal realities. Atlanta's women weren't just survivors, they were warriors in their own right. They served as nurses, factory workers, and volunteers, tirelessly supporting the war effort. But none were as tragically affected as the women at Roswell Mills. These women produced cloth for Confederate uniforms, a fact that didn't escape Sherman's notice. Viewing them as Confederate sympathizers, Sherman would later order the mills burned to the ground and have the women charged with treason. They were loaded onto railroad cars and shipped to Indiana, abandoned to fend for themselves. Their fates remain a mystery. Ghosts of war, lost to history. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis faced his own crisis. Johnston's continued retreats had infuriated him. As the Confederate Army fell back to within 5 miles of Atlanta, Davis feared Johnston would abandon the city without a fight. Determined to hold Atlanta at all costs, Davis made an agonizing decision. On July 17th, he relieved Johnston of command and appointed the audacious, aggressive 32-year-old General John Bell Hood in his place. Hood's background was a tapestry of courage and tragedy. Born to a prominent Kentucky family, he possessed an indomitable will and a fiery disposition. His military career had been marked by both brilliance and personal cost. At Gettysburg, shrapnel rendered his left arm useless. At Chickamauga, a bullet took his right leg. Yet Hood's reputation for bravery and aggression remained untarnished. But Hood's ambition came with a streak of insubordination. While serving under Johnston, he had secretly written to Richmond, criticizing his superior's lack of aggression. "He's not going to fight. If I had the opportunity, I could fight. I will fight," Hood declared. Davis knew Hood's record and gambled on his unrelenting spirit. Hood took command with fiery resolve. Sherman, unable to storm Atlanta's formidable defenses, aimed instead to sever the railroads supplying the city. Hood's mission was clear: keep at least one railroad open, or Atlanta was doomed. Less than 48 hours after his appointment, Hood launched his first attack. On July 20th, he struck near Peachtree Creek, a strategic location north of Atlanta. The Confederates caught Sherman's forces by surprise, but Union veterans rallied and pushed them back. Undeterred, Hood attacked again 2 days later, this time just east of the city in the Battle of Atlanta. 58,000 men clashed in a desperate fight for control of the vital Augusta Railroad. Despite ferocious combat, Sherman's forces held their ground. As the battles raged, Hood faced mounting pressure. On July 28th, one of his subordinates launched a frontal assault near Ezra Church to protect the Macon Railroad, Atlanta's last supply route. The attack was a disaster, costing the Confederates 3,000 men compared to the Union's 700. Yet Hood's gamble kept the railroad open, for now. In the chaos, the Union general, James McPherson, rode too close to the front lines. Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods, firing a volley that killed McPherson instantly. At just 35 years old, his death was mourned by generals on both sides. Sherman, who had considered McPherson a close friend, wept openly. Hood, his former West Point roommate, recorded the loss with sincere sorrow. Undeterred by the setbacks, Sherman resumed his advance, this time targeting the Macon Railroad from the west. The city's fate hung in the balance as the Union forces tightened their grip. Hood, battered but unyielding, clung to the hope of salvation, knowing that every decision he made was a gamble with the highest stakes. By the sweltering summer of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman had Atlanta in his sights. Atlanta, the Confederacy's industrial and transportation heart, lay surrounded by a formidable 12-mile ring of Confederate fortifications. Sherman was no fool. The man knew a brick wall when he hit one, and Atlanta's defenses were thicker than a southern molasses syrup. After several failed attempts to crack through General John Bell Hood's defenses, Sherman found himself pacing his tent, muttering curses under his breath and devising his next move. His frustration boiled over like an untended pot of grits. If he couldn't punch through Hood's ring of steel, he would burn through it. And so began a campaign that would turn Atlanta into an inferno of fire and terror. Sherman called his artillery commanders together with all the subtlety of a raging bull. Fire 50 rounds from every gun that can reach downtown. Fire all the guns that can strike the buildings of Atlanta, he ordered. The artillerymen looked at each other, shrugged, and lit the fuses. The earth shook, the air split open, and the first shells screamed into the heart of Atlanta's buildings. For the remaining 3,000 civilians who hadn't fled Atlanta, the bombardment was a living nightmare. They huddled in cellars, basements, and hastily dug holes as shells exploded day and night. Some cried, others prayed, and all wished Sherman would find another city to pick on. The bombardment would continue for 5 relentless weeks. One of the first tragic casualties was Solomon Lucky, a freed African-American barber who worked out of the Atlanta hotel. A shell struck the iron lamppost just outside. Lucky, innocently going about his day, was hit in the leg by shrapnel. He would bleed out by nightfall, the exact cause uncertain, shock, blood loss, or hemorrhage, but the city mourned. Today, the iron lamppost still stands, a silent witness to Lucky's fate. The shells showed no discrimination. For 10-year-old Lizzie Warner and her father Joseph, the night of August 3rd was their last. Sleeping soundly in their northwest Atlanta home, they never heard the shell that tore through the walls. Lizzie died instantly. Joseph was left disemboweled, dying within an hour. They were laid to rest together in Oakland Cemetery, their story echoing the cruel randomness of war. Another 10-year-old, Carrie Berry, scribbled her terror in her diary. "How I wish the Federals would quit shelling us, and we could get out of the cellar and get some fresh air. The shells get worse and worse every day." For days on end, Atlanta was a city of holes. Wealthy families, particularly those with large backyards, had their enslaved workers dig what were called bomb-proof shelters. These were deep holes, some big enough to fit a couple dozen people. Others fled the city entirely, with enslaved populations shrinking as increasing numbers ran to Union lines. As one young girl noted, "Mary went off this evening, and I don't expect that she will come back anymore." Freedom was close, and enslaved workers were ready to seize it. By late August, Sherman's artillery had unleashed an estimated 30,000 shells on Atlanta. It was the most intense barrage any American city had ever endured. Yet Hood's Confederate army still stood defiant, and Sherman still had nothing to show for the destruction but smoke and rubble. Worse, back home in Chicago, Democrats nominated General George McClellan, calling for peace with the Confederacy. To many, Atlanta's stalemate was proof the Union could never win. Even Abraham Lincoln, despairing over his re-election chances, muttered gloomily, "I'm going to be beaten, and unless some change takes place, badly beaten." Then, on the morning of August 26, something extraordinary happened. The shells stopped. Atlanta residents crawled out of their cellars and bomb-proof holes, blinking into the sudden silence. Had Sherman given up? Was the Union Army retreating? Not quite. Sherman was playing chess while Hood was playing checkers. Tired of pounding his fists against Atlanta's walls, Sherman quietly took most of his army on a massive flanking march, sweeping west and south to cut the last remaining Confederate supply lines. By the time Hood realized what was happening, it was too late. On September 1st, Sherman's men destroyed the last railroad at Jonesboro, severing Atlanta's lifeline. Hood, knowing his army would starve if it stayed, ordered an immediate evacuation. That night, a massive explosion rocked the city as Confederate forces blew up an ammunition train rather than let it fall into Union hands. The blast was so powerful, it shattered windows miles away, and Sherman himself heard the boom 15 miles south. Sherman grinned. He knew exactly what it meant. Hood was retreating. The next day, September 2nd, 1864. Imagine the dust cloud rising on Marietta Road as Mayor James Calhoun and a delegation of Atlanta's finest trot nervously on horseback to meet Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's advance guard. Dressed more for a genteel southern soiree than the humiliating errand ahead, Calhoun clutches a white handkerchief like a man ready to wave his dignity goodbye. He stops in front of the blue-uniformed soldiers, clears his throat, and offers the city of Atlanta on a silver platter, or in this case, the metaphorical ashes of Confederate resistance. Sherman, miles behind, is as casual as a man ordering coffee. When news reaches him, he sits at his camp desk, strokes his beard, and drafts a telegraph to President Lincoln. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. Short, snappy, and just dramatic enough to send shockwaves through the North. When Lincoln reads it, he probably lets out a rare chuckle, imagining the spike this news would give his dwindling re-election hopes. The message electrifies the Northern populace, sparking celebrations, political optimism, and a flurry of newspaper headlines shouting, "Atlanta falls, Lincoln rises." Meanwhile, 10-year-old Carrie Berry sits in what's left of her family's parlor, wide-eyed at the sight of Union soldiers wandering her neighborhood. They are orderly and behave themselves. "I think I shall like the Yankees very well," she pens in her diary. Little did she know that these men would soon be reshaping Atlanta and her life in ways unimaginable. Barely a week later, Sherman drops his infamous Special Field Order 67. The message? Get out. With no time for pleasantries, the remaining civilians, Southern loyalists, Northern sympathizers, and fence-sitters alike, are ordered to leave the city. Mayor Calhoun pleads with Sherman, insisting the forced evacuation would cause overwhelming hardship. Sherman's icy response echoes across the ages. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. Dr. Gordon Jones later clarifies Sherman's motives. Babysitting thousands of civilians wasn't on his agenda, especially when they could be saboteurs, or worse, another mouth to feed using army rations. Atlanta becomes a swirling river of wagons, bundles, and despair. Around 3,000 white Atlantans are forced to leave. Southern loyalists head south. Some dumped unceremoniously behind Confederate lines, where they're crammed onto trains bound for Macon. Others are sent north, clutching what meager belongings they can carry, leaving behind homes they'll never see again. Among them are the so-called secret Yankees, wealthy Northern sympathizers who stayed quiet during the war. Notable figures like banker Alfred Austell and industrialist William Markham are stunned when their loyalty doesn't earn them a free pass. Even Edward Rawson, a Vermont native with a sprawling mansion dubbed the Terraces, watches as his home is repurposed by Union General John White Geary. As historian Dr. Stephen Davis quips, those secret Yankees thought they could protect their property. Nope. Sherman kicked them out too. But not everyone is shown the door. Carrie Berry's father, Madison, scrambles to secure a clerk job with the Union Army. His plan works, and the Berry family becomes one of the few to remain in Atlanta, surrounded by a city that's rapidly becoming a ghost town. While white Atlantans mourn, African Americans rejoice. The arrival of Union troops marks the end of slavery in Atlanta, and for days, freedmen fill the streets, singing, dancing, and celebrating their long-awaited freedom. Yet not all are thrilled with this shift. Sam Richards, a disgruntled Atlanta resident, writes bitterly about the impudent air Negroes put on. "Sorry, Sam, The times are changing. Sherman himself sets up shop in the stately Neal residence, likely enjoying the irony of occupying one of Atlanta's finest homes. Meanwhile, photographer George Barnard roams the streets with his camera, capturing haunting images of wartime Atlanta. These photographs, now priceless historical records, depict a city transformed by fire, war, and despair. While Sherman is consolidating his hold on Atlanta, Confederate General John Bell Hood takes the fight to North Georgia, targeting Sherman's lifeline, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. At Dalton, Hood's forces surround 850 Union soldiers, mostly African Americans of the 44th U.S. Colored Troops. These men, many of them escaped slaves like Hubbard Pryor, face impossible odds. Despite their bravery, their white officers choose surrender, fearing massacre. The aftermath is heartbreaking. Some soldiers are returned to slavery, others are forced into grueling labor, and many die in captivity. Their hopes of freedom and service to their country are dashed in one of the war's most tragic episodes. By November, Sherman knows he can't linger in Atlanta. Hood's antics and the long, vulnerable supply lines force his hand. In a move that changes the course of history, Sherman devises his infamous March to the Sea. "I can make Georgia howl," he declares, promising to destroy everything in his path. His engineers begin demolishing Atlanta's infrastructure, dismantling factories, railroads, and even entire neighborhoods. Buildings deemed too valuable for Confederate use are reduced to rubble. Churches and downtown homes are spared for now, guarded against arson until the army departs. As the Union Army casts ballots in the presidential election, overwhelmingly supporting Lincoln, Sherman prepares for the next phase of his campaign. Hood's forces head west, while Sherman marches south, determined to break the Confederacy's will once and for all. The fall of Atlanta marks a turning point in the Civil War, reinvigorating the North and sealing Lincoln's reelection. For the South, it's a devastating blow. And for the people of Atlanta, black and white, rich and poor, loyalists and rebels, it's a moment that reshapes their lives forever. November 16th, 1864, as dawn breaks over Atlanta, the city is still cloaked in the acrid veil of black smoke rising from its ruins. General William Tecumseh Sherman's army, a staggering 62,000 strong, begins to march out. Behind them, the once thriving industrial hub of the Confederacy lies devastated. Buildings razed, railroads twisted into grotesque Sherman neckties, and warehouses emptied and burned. The message is clear: the South will pay a steep price for rebellion. Among Sherman's officers, some had begun their morning in style, enjoying a final breakfast in grand, empty mansions they had commandeered. But sentimentality wasn't on the menu. After their leisurely meals, they piled furniture, curtains, and anything else combustible into the center of the rooms and lit the mansions ablaze. There was no strategic value to this destruction, just a cold, calculated message of dominance. By the time Sherman's men were done, 40% of Atlanta was reduced to ashes. Sherman wasn't just marching, he was pioneering a bold and terrifying new form of warfare. Having severed his supply lines, he turned his eyes toward Savannah, a tantalizing 250 miles away through hostile Confederate territory. His army carried only essentials, foraging for food and supplies as they went, plundering the rich farmlands of central Georgia. Dr. Gordon Jones aptly describes the audacity of Sherman's plan. What Sherman was contemplating had never been done before. He was cutting loose his supply lines and living off the land. And not just living, thriving. Sherman reportedly used a census map to plot his route with precision, targeting counties brimming with corn, hogs, and cattle. The result, a 50-mile-wide swath of devastation through Georgia's heartland, a grim harvest of war. What the soldiers couldn't eat, they destroyed. Entire barns of grain were torched, livestock slaughtered, railroads ripped apart. It was an unrelenting march of annihilation. Sherman's grim reflection summed it up. To realize what war is, one should follow our tracks. Sherman wasn't just dismantling Southern infrastructure, he was dismantling its morale. "I can make Georgia howl," he had vowed, and he delivered on that promise. The psychological toll was immense. Rumors of Sherman's approach struck terror in towns he hadn't even reached. White Southern women wrote desperate letters to their husbands on the battlefield. "Come home. We can't endure this." Dr. Todd Gross captures it perfectly. Sherman was waging war against the minds of his opponents. And his tactics worked. Confederate resistance crumbled and the South's morale plummeted like a stone. On November 23rd, Sherman's forces entered Milledgeville, Georgia's capital. The Confederate government had already fled, leaving the State House eerily vacant. Sherman's men couldn't resist a bit of dark humor. In a mock legislative session, they repealed Georgia's Ordinance of Secession, laughing as they stuffed Confederate currency into their pockets as useless souvenirs. As Sherman's army marched, thousands of enslaved people, freed by the advancing Union troops, joined the column. They sought liberty and brought invaluable intelligence on Confederate movements. But by the time Sherman's forces neared Savannah, the refugees had become a logistical nightmare. 20 miles outside Savannah, at Ebenezer Creek, tragedy struck. One of Sherman's commanders ordered the army to dismantle a temporary bridge after crossing, leaving the refugees stranded. Confederate cavalry soon arrived, mercilessly attacking. Many refugees, desperate to escape, attempted to swim across. Some succeeded, but countless others drowned or were slaughtered. Dr. Richard Pratt recounts the horror. Elderly men hobbling as best they could, women clutching babies, all caught in chaos. The episode remains one of the darkest stains on Sherman's campaign. On December 21st, Sherman entered Savannah after brushing aside Confederate defenders. The city surrendered without a fight, sparing it the fate of Atlanta. Triumphant, Sherman sent President Lincoln a now famous telegram. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 guns, plenty of ammunition, and 25,000 bales of cotton." In Savannah, Sherman faced an urgent problem: what to do with the thousands of newly freed black refugees. In an unprecedented move, he called a meeting with African American leaders to ask their advice, a rare acknowledgement of their perspective in that era. Their response was clear: land ownership was the key to freedom. 4 days later, Sherman issued Field Order 15, promising 400,000 acres of confiscated coastal land divided into 40-acre parcels for freedmen. The order became the origin of the famous 40 acres and a mule promise. But the plan was short-lived. Within a year, President Andrew Johnson, a staunch opponent of land redistribution, revoked the order. The land was returned to former Confederate owners, dashing the hopes of countless freedmen. Sherman's march to the sea devastated the Confederacy and hastened the end of the Civil War. His tactics of total war redefined military strategy and forever changed the South. But his motives were pragmatic, not altruistic, focused on restoring the Union, not championing emancipation. By the 1870s, Sherman was a celebrated national figure, yet his legacy remained divisive. Southerners who once vilified him began to view him as a necessary evil. In Atlanta, newspapers jokingly credited him with clearing the old city to make way for a new one. Sherman's march was one of the most transformative episodes in American history, a brutal, unrelenting campaign that broke the Confederacy's back and forced the nation to reckon with the realities of total war. Whether hero or villain, Sherman remains one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures. As Dr. Charmaine Patterson aptly notes, it was the most decisive 37 weeks in American history, forever changing who we are as a nation. Want more gripping stories like this? Hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover the drama, intrigue, and humanity behind America's most pivotal moments.